So, pertinence. Whilst the previous definitions have described ownership, they haven't described how ownership might be extended to building, trees, or other disconnected pieces of land. And this is the area covered by parts and pertinence. It provides for rules relating to ownership and the bits to which they convey, are implied through that ownership. So parts and pertinence is legal shorthand for describing heritable rights which automatically pass to successive owners of land by implication. Parts will get out of the way quite quickly. So it's defined by Reed in 96 as a part does not stand in a subordinate relationship, but rather is directly of the principal land. It is suggested, therefore, that the best usage is to reserve parts for those rights which are exercised over the land itself. So a part is shorthand for owned things which are nominally conferred with the ownership right. So that means stuff like buildings or trees or fences, that kind of stuff. It's connected to the land. So where a jurisdiction doesn't nominally confer parts of the ownership right, then parts will need modelling. But most jurisdictions do that, so we can rapidly move on and ignore parts for the moment. Pertinence, however, is different. So a pertinent is defined as followed. A pertinent is a right which pertains to the land and which stands in subordinate and ancillary relationship to that land. It is suggested, therefore, that the best usage is to reserve pertinence for those rights which are exercised in association with the land, but beyond its boundaries. So pertinence then reflect rights held out with the owned land, i.e. they are spatially distinct from it. And here's how this works in practice. So you have your main plot, but then you can have pertinents which are held out with that main plot. And those pertinents can be any form of rights. They can be ownership rights that are either held exclusively or held in common, or they can be non-ownership rights. So the main point being that you have a main plot and it in and of itself holds rights, and those rights can be ownership or non-ownership, but they're out with its spatial extent. So Reed goes on further to describe the different types of pertinent. So there is the things that can be a pertinent, referred to as invariable pertinents. So these are beneficial, subordinate, and primary rights, servitudes, easements, for example. There's the things that could be a pertinent, and this reflects uncertainty associated with an incomplete register. So these are presumed pertinents, and in this instance, they're talking about it in a specifically Scottish way, and possible pertinents, and this is looking at things that have adjacency to the principal land. And they also define things which cannot be pertinents. So property which is unavailable in a pertinential relationship. And again, this is specifically about the jurisdiction, but it has generic concepts which are useful to determine. So let's go into more detail about the properties unavailable as pertinents. So in terms of this pertinential ownership, the latter category is of the most importance, and it's described thus. The rights of salmon fishing and other legal separate tenements are unavailable either as parts or as pertinents. They can never pass with land by implication, but require an express grant. This exclusion does not apply to conventional separate tenements. So hence ownership rights which can be held as pertinents may be limited within each jurisdiction. But in Scotland, they make a specific case for the difference between conventional separate tenements which can be held as pertinents and legal separate tenements which can't be held as pertinents. We'll come back to this. So why legal separate tenements, and why don't legal separates make good pertinents? And there's good arguments as to why it doesn't happen. So in the legislation in Scotland, the Land Registration Scotland Act 2012, section 12.3 states the following in relation to pertinents: that the keeper need not represent a plot of land, such as is mentioned in section 3.7, a pertinent, as a separate cadastral unit, but may instead include it in the cadastral unit representing the plot or plots of land of which it is a pertinent. So this would have the effect of extinguishing the legal separate tenement by reintegrating that right into a different cadastral unit. But if you did that, there wouldn't be an explicit title record that reflects the express grant of that pertinential legal separate tenement. And so if you have removed that express grant, then the ownership right would revert by implication back to the Crown or whoever is defined in the legal statute. So it essentially evaporates it because it's not expressly granted anymore. So the requirement to maintain the express grant is there so that the implied regalia right is not extinguished. And that generally makes sense. So there are good reasons here as to why legal separate tenements don't make good pertinence, because that express grant is lost, and it means that the right is lost as well. The main plot and the ownership pertinents collectively create what we've been describing as the subjects. So the subjects is the set of ownership rights defined by the main plot and used to derive title. So the subject is essentially the set of ownership associated with the main plot. And that is quite an important relationship when we get into the process of defining title later on. So, what are examples of ownership pertinent? It's used to model shared driveways, remaining areas of a housing development that are held in common ownership, flatted buildings, pens, car parking spaces, and bin stores.